Welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about sprint. Quite possibly the reason why I started this entire lecture series. Sprint is one time-boxed iteration of a continuous development cycle. More intuitively, this is how it is structured. Agile is a concept, it's a methodology. And Scrum is a framework that makes Agile happen. And Sprint is actual iteration that we do to make Scrum work. So within a sprint, planned amount of work has to be completed by the team and made ready for review. In other words, without sprint, Scrum doesn't really work. Without Scrum, Agile doesn't really work. The duration of a sprint is usually 1 to 4 weeks. What that means is we plan something short and concise. We make that happen, and by the iteration of this process, we make the Agile work. And it's complicated and simple at the same time. What we are trying to do here is, if you understand the process of Agile, we understand the product backlog, as in what we need to do for the product in the end. What we do in the sprint is we plan something small and concise and the part of this entire product backlog, and we create sprint goal and sprint backlog to make it work so that we can actually see what's going on here and check and see if we are on the right track. Now, you have seen this framework before, and that's boxed area. To the left is a sprint planning. How does it really work? Okay, here's the thing. Here are some concepts that you need to understand. Sprint goal is an objective that will be met within the sprint. So pretty much, okay, this is what we are going to do at the end of the sprint. Here's a goal, here's our objective. In order to do that, we need to take a look at the product backlog, the list of everything that needs to be done about the product. Sprint backlog is a subset of product backlog that we are going to do for a certain specific sprint. So product backlog is a big set, and sprint backlog is a subset of a product backlog that is specifically for a certain sprint. Now we are trying to check a couple of things here. One is a capacity and a velocity. Capacity is pretty much resources that we have, what we can do with. Velocity is how quickly and effectively you can finish one task. So sprint goal, product backlog, sprint backlog, capacity and velocity, those are the things that you need to know before you start anything. Now, this picture actually tells you a lot more than what I just described. This is about sprint planning, not the end result of sprint, but sprint planning itself. Before we do the sprint planning, we need to talk about product backlog. We need to know something about the team's capacity and velocity. And we need to know something about current product status and if there is any constraints to what we want to do. During the planning process, we suggest what should be done and how it should be done. And at the end of the sprint planning session, we are going to have a sprint goal and a sprint backlog. This is what we are going to do, what we are trying to accomplish at the end of this sprint, and these are the features that we are going to do something about. So if you can actually categorize input and during the process and output of the sprint planning this way, you can fill this out and create a board that'll help you and guide you through the sprint process. So what you do is review your product roadmap, that's the first thing you need to do, and groom your product backlog and update user stories. Yes, user stories are good. When you are creating this in the first place, you put a lot of thoughts into it, but when you actually do the sprint, you need to think about exactly what you want to do about it, so you need to update it. And propose a sprint goal and a backlog before the sprint planning meeting. That means all the team members and product owners, they come in and knowing what they are getting into. Then use data and experience for your sprint planning meeting and walk through each user story and describe what tasks need to be done. Okay, so I'll say this again. Review product roadmap and update the user story and propose a goal and a sprint backlog before the meeting. And during the meeting, use data and experience so you can actually plan it properly and suggest what tasks need to be done, exactly what need to be done, and what the end result might be as an output of sprint planning. And when you are doing the sprint planning or doing the sprint, or after the sprint, you need to track what you are doing. So there are 4 things you may want to keep in mind. One is number of stories or story points assigned to each sprint. Do you want to do 3 at the same time? Or might be 1 point would be enough for your team. You need to decide. And velocity. How many story points were assigned and completed? Sometimes you assign little too many points to each sprint, say 17, and you cannot do anything about it because there are too many things to attack. Then you need to cut it down. And about the same argument, carryover. How many items were assigned to the current sprint but not completed? So velocity says something about how many were assigned and completed. Carryover, it actually lets you know about how many were not completed. So when you're looking at these numbers, you know what? Our team can handle 2 or 3 points at the same time, but if more than that, it actually slows them down. Then you need to keep the points to 2 to 3, so you can be as effective as possible. And story state, every story points, every user story, every feature, you need to say, it's in progress, we are working on it, it's completed, you have to keep track of it. Then you know exactly where you are and do a better job for sprint planning in the next sprint. That is pretty much, in a nutshell, what sprint is. Now, as I said, Agile is a concept. Scrum is a framework that makes Agile possible. And sprint is actual work that you do to make the sprint work. So in order to do that, there has to be a sprint goal and a sprint backlog. If you forget about this whole thing, that's okay, but don't forget this. Everything that you need to do is a product backlog. You need to do 1 to number 117. That's a product backlog. Now, how many can you do in this project, this small project called sprint? 2 to 3. Just assign them and work on it, make something happen, and come up with a workable increment and move on to the next sprint. That's what you do. Big set of everything that you need to do, product backlog, and subset of backlog, product backlog, that's a sprint backlog, what you need to do for the sprint. If you don't forget about that, then you are going to be okay. Now, we said all these things about Agile, Scrum, and Sprint. What you need to do is actually create a product backlog and do the sprint planning so you can start the sprint. That's it for today, and I'll see you next time.